Hi, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'd like to start off thanking some of my colleagues at Long Term for supporting me. Also some shout outs to the RPI Sec crew. I see them sitting over there. Thanks for coming. And thanks to Apple for fixing the bugs we reported. So my name is Alex Radocea. I've been working in security quite a while now. And I really got started playing a lot of CTFs. I'm a recovering addict, but the recovery isn't going so well since we qualified again this year. And unfortunately, I might play a little bit. So please distract me. It would be good for me. Get some sunshine. And I really enjoy CTFs because you get a lot of hands-on experience. So it's one thing to learn about it in class, but it's another thing to go and actually try to write an exploit. And usually you learn a lot just failing and making a lot of mistakes. And another thing that I love about Black Hat is we're here to celebrate a lot of mistakes. So defense is hard, and if you only work in offense, sometimes you don't see that. But I do love a good bug, and that's what this talk is about. So what is iCloud Keychain? iCloud Keychain is secret syncing and recovery in the cloud. That's kind of hard to pull off if you think about it, because you're talking about some very sensitive material going on servers that are maybe not even in control of your own company. Because when you talk about the cloud nowadays, many of the large companies, they want redundancy, so they go to different providers. So how do you exchange secrets on other people's machines, which is what iCloud Keychain is doing. So iCloud Keychain was designed to be highly secure, very strong end-to-end cryptography, and we'll go more into detail about what that means. What is end-to-end cryptography? And is it too strong nowadays, according to some law enforcement? And it's designed to be resilient, even if a server is backdoored or there's a rogue employer, someone manages to break in. And it's also resilient when someone has their iCloud password compromised. Back in 2016, we saw something like 300 million credentials get leaked. And all the hacks weren't in 2016. They're happening in like 2012, 2013 with like LinkedIn, MySpace, Tumblr. In 2016, they surfaced to the public, so the average teenager all of a sudden had access to 300 million passwords, some of which would presumably work with iCloud. But Keychain was designed to be strong even if someone has your iCloud password, because you need an additional device or an additional password besides that to actually get in. And we found some bugs that we're going to celebrate here today that are now fixed. And we're going to talk about Keychain Sync in detail. There is a white paper. There was a talk last year at Black Hat that covered some of it. But the details of the protocol, even though the code is open source, are not really well known. So in this talk, we talk a little bit about them and try to bring light to how some of it works to the best of our abilities. And this is not the first presentation about iCloud Keychain. There have been some in the past. In 2014, Andrei Blanco focused on the recovery mechanism for a forensics company doing data recovery. There's also a talk last year. It provides a great overview of how Keychain works. And then earlier this year, Elcomsoft, also focusing on data recovery, did a presentation on whether or not the two-factor auth accounts are secure or not with iCloud Keychain. And the security guide is a great reference as well. When looking at crypto bugs, there's a quote that always inspires me with a nice picture of Robert Morris Sr. and his beard. So Robert Morris Sr. is the father of Robert Morris Jr., who wrote the Morris Worm. And he was a cryptanalyst at one point or another. And I don't know too much about all he did, but I hear he was pretty good at it. And he says that when you're talking about signals and information, you should really assume that your adversary will not stop at any limits. So you should really go all out and defend something against all feasible threats when you're building a system. And when you're talking about end-to-end crypto, you're kind of talking about that sort of system where you're really trying to defend against a lot of different threats. And iCloud Keychain has two major features associated with it. Part of it is the recovery. So if you lose all of your phones, your tablets, your computer, you can still get your iCloud Keychain data back. So that's what the recovery is about. And then there's the syncing, which is keeping all the secrets synchronized across all of your devices so they're available so you can use them painlessly. And then you can have better passwords that are more secure without having to remember them. So the recovery is based on an HSM escrow system. The HSM is there to prevent brute force attacks and kind of people accessing the data too much, trying to pull off different schemes. There's also SMS verification. It seems there have been some problems in general with SMS. Now that two-factor is becoming very popular, attackers have been looking at SMS, but it's still a good additional measure because it increases the cost of an attack. And then in addition to the Apple ID password for getting to Keychain Sync, there can be an additional password that's needed for recovery. So when you set up, there's something called an iCloud security code that's separate from your Apple ID and separate from your device passcode. However, if you have two-factor auth, there is a device passcode, and this is what the Elcomsoft talk, Hack in the Box, went into depth about. And then you think, okay, well, I have these additional passwords, but I'm still sending them to Apple, right? So how secure can that be? Well, it's actually not so bad because you do something known as SRP, which uses some hashing and some exponentiation so that you don't actually reveal your password to those back-end services. You kind of do a proof of work that you know the right password. And then you'll get access to something that you can decrypt locally. So it's pretty good. Recovery, though, is not what we'll be focusing on. We're mostly going to be focusing on the syncing feature. So syncing all of your secrets to all your devices using the cloud, also known as someone else's computer. And doing it with end-to-end encryption, so it doesn't matter whether it's China Telecom or Amazon or Google Cloud or whoever is hosting, because they're just serving as a conduit. They won't have access to that data unless they have access to your devices as well. And it's about building up a circle of trust in your devices. We're going to talk about the protocol that's there and what that looks like. And part of syncing is also about how does someone join the circle of trust and what does that approval look like, and we'll talk about that. And there are two sort of protocols involved. So the circle thing, it's not like a real protocol that's documented, but if you read the documentation and the code, it's building blocks for doing this kind of stuff. So secure object sync circle, I'll just call it circle, SOS circle. I'm going to call it a protocol. Maybe it's not a protocol, but for our purposes it will be. And then there's OTR. Anyone here heard of OTR before, off the record? Do you guys know it was an iCloud Keychain Sync? So this wasn't very well documented in the white paper. There's no occurrences of OTR. And we reached out to Ian Goldberg, and I think he was quite happy to see it was there, but he also didn't know it was there. So it's open source code, but as far as we know, we're the first ones talking about this. So the protocol's still a little bit underexplored, I would say, for researchers. And let's talk about the circle part. Somewhere in the cloud, there's a blob of data that holds signatures from all the different devices. This is a signed syncing circle, and devices also get a local copy. And that's a circle of trust that we're talking about. And the protocol is about how people can join the circle. You can have an approving device approve and add you in, or you can also join it if you have that iCloud security code, or if you have two-factor auth, a device passcode. So it's also about how that works. And the math that's involved for the signatures here is 256-bit ECDSA on SecP256R1. So I'm not particularly a cryptographer. I'm more of a code breaker. But to understand what this curve is, it's a NIST curve. Bitcoin uses SecP256K1, and SecP256R1 is the one DJ Bernstein doesn't like so much, but it's fundamental to the security of the internet. It's used in TLS and lots of other places. So it's a very, very standard algorithm. How does circle work? How does somebody join a circle? So when someone first sets up an iCloud account and they turn this on, a circle is created. And what's in the circle? So you have peer information that has information like the computer name, the version of the protocol that device uses, and an identity key, the public key. The private key stays on the device. And then there's a signature for this peer info, and then they create the circle, and the circle is signed not only with the identity key, but also the user's current iCloud password. Now, if a second device wants to join, they make a request to join the circle. And it includes the identity key of the new device, and it's also signed with that Apple ID password. The first device will get a notification, and the user will manually approve it, and then they'll update the circle and say, okay, the second device is now also part of the circle, and it will be signed. And when devices join like this, there's some automatic countersigning that can happen. So the other devices, if they see that appear that they already trust, has signed something, they will automatically sign it as well without having to do another user notification to each device, because that would be a nightmare. And because all the different devices countersign, when a new device joins, any of the devices that are in the circle can approve the new device. And this is all on the white paper. It kind of describes how it works. It's pretty straightforward. But there are some things to think about for usability. So what would happen if you lost all of your devices while you were traveling? So if you go do the recovery, great, you have your passwords. But now the new device wouldn't necessarily have a way to join the circle because you don't have an approving device to go and update that. So it seems like kind of a tricky thing from usability. And the full details of these aren't really documented in the white paper, and we're going to discuss this a little bit about kind of how it looks like and how it works. Oh, excuse me. So let's take a step back and talk about some of the different passwords that are involved, because it's a little confusing. There's the Apple ID password, there's device passcodes, there's the SMS code, and there's this iCloud security code. So if you have a default account that doesn't have two-factor auth enabled, to join a circle with an approving device, you just need that Apple ID password entered on both devices. You can also join the circle without an approving device if you also have the SMS code and iCloud security code. So it is possible to join on a new phone without device approval. And then if you have two-factor auth, the difference there is that the device passcode will be used instead of the iCloud security code. And then if somebody didn't set an iCloud security code, in the first case, they wouldn't have a way to join this way. And the interesting thing is that the circle is not reset when this happens, meaning that the existing devices aren't booted off when you join in this way. But from what we've described, there's this identity key. So do the new devices have it? And if you look at the details, the identity keys are only on those devices. They're set in a keychain protection class that never leaves. And they won't be in the escrow either, because this class is not synced up to iCloud backup. So the new devices wouldn't get it. So we actually have another peer that's in there. When the circle is first established, there's also an iCloud identity key that is created. And in the code, this is called a hidden peer, and is created with some different attributes that can be synchronized into the iCloud keychain. So these are available from the escrow. And it's this cloud identity that can be used to go ahead and join the circle. And it's kind of interesting to see this there because it's not well documented. And this is what the updated circle protocol looks like. When Alice first set up that circle, there's also this cloud identity that's also in there. And it can also sign the circles. And this is what lets new devices join the circles without booting off the other ones. And when you're looking at protocols like this, when you see things that are not documented, it's usually a good thing to check out. So far, this seems pretty okay. Because even if this was an iCloud backups, those key bags are still wrapped with the UID key for the device. So someone on an iCloud server wouldn't be able to get to this. And another thing is that the escrow itself, you can't get that unless you bypass some other mechanisms. So it's pretty okay. And that was basically Circle. And the second part of this is off the record, which is used for the end-to-end encryption. And it's got forward secrecy, so that if someone has a key at one point in time, they won't necessarily be able to get the plaintext of previous communications, as well as deniability, which is something that might be useful for a chat, but not necessarily critical for keychain syncing. And it works with Diffie-Hellman key exchange. That's how OTR sets up a secure channel. And then peers can verify each other as part of the protocol. And the encryption over that secure channel is done with AES and counter mode. And OTR uses rotating keys. So in the context of where does this communication actually happen, it happens over iCloud services. So there's a key value store as well as directory services or IDS. That's some of the stuff used in iMessage and other places. And the first layer of security here is you have TLS. So it's already encrypted from the get-go. But if it was only TLS, then anybody on the receiving end would get plaintext access to those communications. And it's really the end-to-end encryption that allows Apple to make claims that it cannot be decrypted by Apple or other devices that are not part of the syncing circle. So here's kind of a pie-in-the-sky view of how the OTR key exchange works. There's a hash commitment that gets sent out by the initiator, and this prevents some malleability attacks. I actually did some research on Telegram where they don't do something like this, and it's possible to weaken the protocol. So OTR tries to defend against those kinds of attacks. And then they set up a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And once they set up that secure channel, then the peers send some packets so that they can verify that they know each other. And the peers verify each other with those identity keys that are in that circle. And once they've done this, they have the secure channel now, and they can start exchanging secrets, and they can exchange passcode. They can exchange password material. So iCloud Keychain has Wi-Fi passwords, credit card numbers, that kind of stuff. And one thing about OTR, a long-standing feature, is they really want group chat. So some of the new protocols out there, like Signal, they have group chat support for encryption. OTR doesn't have that. It's peer-to-peer. Direct, one peer talks to another. There's no shared key across all the devices. So when iCloud Keychain gets set up, all of your devices actually have a pairwise communication to one another. So performance-wise, that's not great, but when it comes to sharing passwords, it's more than okay. And Apple states some pretty strong security goals that they have for iCloud Keychain. They want to protect the passwords, even when an iCloud account is compromised. So if the password gets leaked, reused, someone had a weak one, shouldn't matter. Their credit card info should still be secure. They want to keep it secure even if somebody manages to break into the iCloud server, which is pretty much impossible to do without something like end-to-end cryptography. And also when third parties access user accounts. And this is from the white paper. And it's kind of a visual of the different layers you have. So the very first layer you have is TLS. Then you have the security of the iCloud servers themselves. Not anybody can go and walk into a data center and access that. And then the last layer of defense is really this end-to-end encryption that they built up with Circle and OTR. And if someone wanted to gain access to that plaintext password material, they would have a few different paths. So these are some of them. First one is just write a really good exploit that gets you right into the device. You have some kind of remote exploit, gets you into the kernel, then you have complete access to the security daemon, and passwords that do come down to that you'd have access to. That's supposed to run something like $1 million today, or at least that's how much the FBI pays for them. And the second path is if you want to just attack this protocol, you have a few different options. You kind of have to beat two layers. So the first layer is how do you get access to the data that's in the iCloud services. So the first thing you could do is get somebody's iCloud password. The second thing you could do is compromise iCloud services. So rogue employee, rogue data center, it's the cloud. And the third one is if you had access to TLS, then you would basically get access to that first layer. But now you still have the end-to-end encryption that you got to defeat. So then you need some kind of flaw in the OTR protocol or the circle setup if you can somehow get a device approved without a user notification, or maybe phish someone if it comes down to that. Phishing usually always works eventually. But we went the OTR flaw route in this. So we found a cryptographic failure in OTR. So it's not the open source OTR that you would have if you go to like libOTR. This is a custom implementation from Apple, but it is open source, so you can check it out. And we found a flaw there, and we also found a memory corruption flaw. And these were slightly exacerbated because there's no TLS key pinning. So any of the CAs that are trusted by an iPhone could have potentially been abused for this attack. And the OTR failure was in the signature verification. So here we have some lines of code from the vulnerable routine. And this is a routine, SecVerify signature in Mac. If it returns successfully, that means that the signature checked out and it's also established the secure channel correctly, so it's done the key exchange. And when they're parsing some bytes off the wire, they set the error code. So usually just reading bytes, if the packet's long enough, it'll succeed. And if there's a failure, it's supposed to reset that error code and say, something went wrong, we failed this key exchange. But here you have some error handling where the code did not properly reset the error code. So this is very similar to Goto fail. And when the Goto fail flaw came out, at that time, this code lived in the same project. So it's kind of interesting that people who tried to detect that bug with static analysis failed. And essentially what you can do is provide an invalid size field that will shortcut the signature check. And it's pretty trivial to trigger this flaw. So here's a 32-byte OTR packet that will do it. You just encode a size field. That doesn't make sense. And then you have some data later with the actual key material that you're setting up. But that's about it. And it's a pretty trivial bug, and it would have allowed a man-in-the-middle attacker that had some kind of access to someone's keychain circle to start negotiating OTR. And what's kind of interesting is that this attack could be pulled off silently. So with OTR, it uses ephemeral keys. And the user wouldn't see necessarily notification. And because it's a logic flaw, it's highly reliable. So sometimes it's the simple bugs that are most devastating. And this really undermines some of those goals. If someone's iCloud account and password was compromised, or somebody gained access to an iCloud server, they would have been potentially able to pull off this attack and start receiving Wi-Fi passwords, credit card numbers, all this really interesting data. But of course, there's still TLS that they'd have to get through. Now there's actually a second flaw that we found, and we found this one first, which is what led to the other one. There's an unbounded stack allocation. So we reported these back in January, but since then there's been a really great and thorough presentation or article by Qualys called Stack Clash. So if you want to understand these flaws, you should check that out. Basically, the code is threaded. So if you work with embedded systems, you know that you don't have so much stack room. And threaded code is kind of the same deal. So if you send a really long OTR packet, that packet data would start to overlap with an adjacent thread stack. So you could get program counter control through that. And this could have been a potential sandbox escape to root. So this is a daemon that lots of applications communicate with in one form or another. You would need some entitlements, though, for this one. So the remote path might be more interesting because of that. However, this is tricky to exploit because there's a race condition between the executing thread and the writing thread hitting the guard page. So kind of a crappy bug if you're into exploit development. So wrapping up, I think it's fascinating. It's awesome to see end-to-end cryptography in a form that's also usable for tons and tons of people. Because the usability and end-to-end cryptography are actually at direct odds with one another. It's about keeping people out of data. And what happens when you lose all your stuff? How do you get back to your data? So we talked about how Keychain Sync works, some of the inner details. I hope you guys found those interesting. And we reviewed a crypto failure. I think something that our industry needs to do is step up its game when it comes to static analysis. And there are leaps and bounds there. But when it comes to Goto fail, I actually have an open challenge to static analysis companies. Go detect both these bugs. They're in the same project. So Goto fail was Goto fail repeated twice on the line. You can find that with grep. But can you do semantic analysis to detect both of these? So some researchers have reached out to me, and we'll take a look too. This should be detectable. And there's also some crypto testing talks by JP Masson that would have definitely detected this flaw. Another thing for Apple, I don't think the documentation is sufficient here for researchers. I think for an average person, the details of the math that's used, that's great, but it's nice to see, it would be nice to see in depth how the protocol actually works. So some companies out there are starting to document their end-to-end crypto in great detail. And it'd be great to see that for iCloud Keychain too. And in particular, I think some of the two-factor stuff could use some more research. What are the exact security properties there? So Elcomsoft alluded to some things, but they didn't go into great detail either. So that about wraps it up. So thank you. And I'd like to take any questions you guys may have.